Pope Francis is asking forgiveness again for the abuses that Indigenous peoples suffered in Canada's residential schools. Now, this is a live look at the Vatican this hour. The Pope gave his weekly address there earlier this morning, and he dedicated his talk to reflections on his trip last week to Canada.
It was unlike other journeys. In fact, the main motivation was to meet the Indigenous peoples, to express to them my closeness and my sorrow, closeness of the Church, my sorrow, and to ask forgiveness for the harm done to them.
Pope Francis apologized at several stops last week on what he called his pilgrimage of penance in Canada. This morning, he was again speaking on the role of members of the Catholic Church and the harms done to Indigenous people. Abby Kugadasan joins us live now from London with more on this. So, Abby, tell us about what the Pope is saying about his visit to Canada.
There is much reflection on this trip during the weekly address at the Vatican today. He asked for forgiveness for the harm done by Christians, including Catholics in Canada. Let's have a listen.
There was unfortunately no shortage of those who participated in programs that today we understand is unacceptable and contrary to the gospel. And for this, I went to ask for forgiveness in the name of the Church.
The Pope spoke of the long history of Indigenous people and the painful memory of abuse that they suffered. He also talked about how the most beautiful thing he'd seen in Canada was the harmony between Indigenous people and the land. So reflecting on his trip further today, but not speaking further on what else the Catholic Church will do to advance that healing and reconciliation.
And Abby, Indigenous leaders, even some Christians, have been calling for Pope Francis to rescind what's called the doctrine of discovery. Why is that important?
This doctrine goes back to the 15th century, and as you mentioned, Indigenous leaders have been calling on the Pope to rescind it. The doctrine is a set of edicts from the Catholic Church that was used to justify European colonization and spread Christianity. Spanish, Portuguese, and English kings used it to seize new lands and plunder them in the name of exploration and their Christian faith. I spoke with Professor Michael Walsh here earlier this morning, and he says the Pope could have renounced the doctrine while he was in Canada if he was going to do it at all.
It wouldn't have been difficult for him to do that. I mean, I think there were various missteps in Canada, and that was one. He could have done that. But of course, popes do find it very difficult, given the nature of their office and the nature of their authority, to go back on what their predecessors have done. They don't feel they can change the rules backwards.
Another professor of theology pointed out to me that Pope Paul III did oppose the enslavement of Indigenous people with his own decrees in the 16th century. But as we know, European nations continue to colonize, and churches in countries like Canada continue to forcibly convert Indigenous people. And the doctrine of discovery went on to be used as the foundation for the legal system in the U.S. and in Canada, one that did not recognize the rights of Indigenous people on their own land. And the doctrine also provided the justification for residential schools that caused deep suffering for generations over centuries. And Indigenous communities have made it clear that hearing the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope, renounce this doctrine would help the process of reconciliation.
Abby Kugadasan in London. Thank you.